My ears are cold this morning, y'all. It is cold out there. This morning I want to talk about what we might call the land of wrinkly giants. That's kind of how it's described in Genesis chapter 6. If you open to Genesis chapter 6, you have described there a place that has what's called giants. It could be the idea of very large people. It could be the idea of very brave people. It could be both. And you have very old giants because, these people were living maybe even up to 1,000 or so years long. And so I imagine if you were very old and very tall, you would still be very wrinkly at the end of your life either way. And so the land of wrinkly giants was not a good place. It was a place where it says God he regretted in a sense that he had made this creation, that he looked out and almost exclusively he could find nobody who cared anything about doing right, who cared about taking care of their neighbor, who cared about trying to think beyond just what they want day to day. He says that he made a plan then that within the span of 120 years, he was going to flood the world and destroy everything that was on it. And I imagine we wouldn't have a Bible today and there wouldn't be anything left if it weren't for one person, of course, being Noah. And what's interesting about Noah is if you think about what's really being implied here, what the Bible record is really saying about what God cares about, what's important to God, is that really, as we look at the first part of Genesis and consider God's home, the place that he created for us to dwell in, but also the place that he created for himself to dwell among his people in. When we look at God's home, it is a home for one. Really, what we mean by that is a home for one kind of person. All the people in the world, Noah was the only one. He is the one kind of person that finds a place in God's home. And so Noah's story has a lot of relevance to us because today God is still the same God. He hasn't changed at all. Today God is still looking for people to be a part of his kingdom, to be a part of his home. And today God still wants the same kind of people. But it's not just any actions or anything will do. It's still just this one kind of person. And so I'd like to consider from Noah's story this morning the one kind of person that Noah was so that we have an understanding of what exactly we're looking for. It says in chapter 6 and verse 8, Noah found grace or favor in the eyes of the Lord. And it says in verse 9, this is the genealogy of Noah. Noah was a just man, perfect in his generations, and he walked with God. This is the general description of Noah. This is why he found grace. This is why he is that one person that God was looking for. And the first thing that we see from this is that Noah was an attentive person, that he really cared about what God said. And so the only kind of person that finds a home with God is a person who is attentive, like Noah was attentive. And if you want to move the slide forward just one, Keith, I'd appreciate that. Noah was attentive to what God had to say. It says that he was just in verse 9. Just is the idea of someone who cares about what's right. You think about a just judge. A just judge is someone who isn't worried about their paycheck or anything like that. A just judge is just worried about making sure that everything is fair for both parties. And so he cared about what was right. It'll also say that about Noah in chapter 7 and verse 1. In chapter 7 and verse 1, God speaks to Noah and he says, "Come into the ark, you and all your household, because I have seen that you are righteous." That's the same Hebrew word for just, that you care about what's right, about doing the right thing. Now that doesn't mean that Noah was perfect. Romans 3:23, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. He certainly made his mistakes, but he cared about what's right. He wanted to do what was right. And so it says that he was just. It says that he was perfect in his generation. Now, I just said Noah wasn't perfect, right? And then the Bible says he was perfect. But it doesn't mean the idea that he never sinned. Perfect in his generation is literally the idea of complete. He was mature. He among all the people that lived on the earth at that time, he was the one who had a mature mindset, a complete mindset, that he tried to see things how God saw things, so that he could respond to others in the way that God would respond to others. And so he was just, he was mature. He is what Hebrews 11 and verse 7 describes. Notice Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 7. In Hebrews 11, the Hebrews writer is telling us about all the faithful people. And it says in Hebrews 11 and verse 7, by faith Noah, being divinely warned of things not yet seen, moved with godly fear, prepared an ark for the saving of his household, by which he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness, which is according to faith. And so, again, his righteousness was not based on his perfection. His righteousness, it says, is according to faith. That's what Romans 3 and 4 describes. Abraham was righteous not because he was perfect, but because when God spoke, Abraham heard and believed and trusted and just did what God said, even though he had made mistakes in the past. That's the kind of righteousness that Noah had. It says that he prepared an ark for the saving of his household because he was moved with godly fear. That when he heard God's word, he was attentive to it because he feared, he knew that if he didn't listen, those were serious consequences. And I think that's one of the primary things we see from Noah in Genesis chapter 6 is what set Noah apart from everyone else is that Noah is the only one who really took God seriously. He's the only one who really heard God and said, God must mean what he says. And so because of that, if God said jumped, Noah said how high? And that's, God says build an ark, and he gives them all the specifications, and we could talk about gopher wood and cubits and all the different things, and you can go to places like Kentucky. They have a sort of museum there, and it has what they think is a life-size model of the ark, and I've never been, but maybe someday I can. And apparently it's very impressive to see that from miles away you can see this giant ark that just astounding to think of Noah and his 3 sons and their wives building this ark just with their hands and whatever tools that they could make on their own. I don't know what technology was like before the flood, but I don't think they probably had cranes and electricity and things like that. And so, they built this giant thing over the course of a little more than 100 years because they were moved with godly fear, because God said jump, and Noah said, how high? Well, ark was pretty tall, so pretty high, I think. But he decided, he made his decisions aware of the fact that God has a right to judge. And that's, Genesis 6 doesn't even question that. It says God looked and he saw the wickedness, the evil intent of the hearts of man. It says in verse 5 that he saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, that every intent of the thought of his heart was only evil continually. And everything that these people thought of was always selfish and always just based on what they wanted continually, without stop. That there was no effort to try to change. They stumbled sometimes, but they got back up and kept trying. They were happy to be this way. They kept being this way. They wanted to be this way. And Genesis 6 doesn't question whether God has the right to judge. It just assumes he does have that right. He is the creator. He is the highest one, the most high. He is the good one who created all of these good things. Genesis 1:1 says over and over again, it was good, it was good. He created it all to be good. And because he is benevolent, because he is good, because he is both love and just at the same time, he has the right to judge. That's the idea of Daniel chapter 7. In Daniel chapter 7, verses 9 through 14, it describes the God who sits on the throne. It calls him the Ancient of Days. And again, Daniel in Daniel chapter 7, starting in verse 19, doesn't question whether God has the right to judge or not. His explanation is, he is the Ancient of Days, the only one who's always been here, the only one who predates all of us, the only one who could really have the right to judge because he was first and he was highest and he's always best. He always has the best motivations. He always has the best love. He always has the deepest love, as evidenced by many things that he'd done, but especially his Son. Because he is the Ancient of Days, he has a right to sit on the throne. And that's what it says in Daniel 7:22. It says that the Ancient of Days came and a judgment was made on the nations of the earth. He has that right to do it. And so if we're attentive to God, if we're attentive to pleasing God, then we make our decisions aware that God has the right to judge. I think sometimes that's a little bit hard to do. We make our decisions sometimes with a little bit of, maybe you might call it, I can't think of the word, begrudging, that's it. A little bit begrudging. We make our decisions a little bit begrudging because while we know that God has the right to judge, we don't always like the judgments that he makes. We don't always like the word that he's given. We don't always like the path that he's provided. We don't like what we might have to give up, or we don't like the hard things that we might have to do. And we become a little bit begrudging of that. I understand that. But Noah shows us, I mean, my guess is when on Noah's 600th birthday, when he was planning what the next 600 years of his life were going to be like, he's like a little about middle age there, right? And so, he's planning the next 600 years of his life. My guess is he probably wasn't thinking a giant boat. That wasn't his life plan at that point, probably. And being the only righteous person, he probably wasn't the kind of guy who tried to draw a lot of attention to himself. He maybe wasn't out there announcing all the time, I'm the only one who's doing what's right. That's not how you stay very safe in a wicked world. But God gives him a role that requires him to build this giant boat, for one. That's a lot of hard manual labor. And to draw a lot of attention to himself. I don't know if you've ever tried to build a giant boat. I haven't. But my guess is that once you get past a certain phase, it's kind of hard to keep it hidden. It's just going to be out there. Everyone can see your giant boat, and all of them, but they're just selfish people. So they're just looking at this as why and what can I get out of it? And I can't imagine that was an easy 120 years for Noah. That wasn't his plan. He could have been begrudging, but God said jump, and Noah said how high, because he knew God has the right to judge. And more than that God has the power to destroy. And that's, if he had the right to judge but no power behind it, it wouldn't really make a difference. He could say whatever he wanted to. That's, governments do that all the time, right? They say you have to do something, but they have no power to enforce it, and so nobody listens, and there's nothing really anyone can do about it. But God doesn't just have the right to judge. He has the power to destroy. That's what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 10 and verse 28. Matthew chapter 10 and verse 28, Jesus says, "Fear him who is able to destroy both body and soul." Fear the only one who is able to destroy not just the life that you have here, but for all eternity. When God speaks, Noah knew he was perfectly serious about the flood. Noah knew that he was not kidding, he was not joking, and he was capable of doing it. And the record shows that he did. That really meant something to Noah. That should have meant something to the people of his day. It should mean something to us today. As we continue, though, we notice that he builds the ark, he gets on the ark, he stays on the ark for quite some time. And in fact, that's really the next thing we notice, starting in chapter 8, that if we're going to please God, it's really only the patient who are able to do that. Noah had to be, I think, extraordinarily patient, cooped up on an ark with a bunch of animals for a little more than a year overall. And it's interesting if you note how it goes through and describes it. It says in the 600th year of his life, chapter 7 and verse 11, says in the 600th year of his life, in the second month on the 17th day, that's when it started flooding. And it says in verse 13, on the very same day, Noah and Noah's sons got on the ark with him, and God closed the door. He shut him in. And so it starts off, and then it says at the end of the chapter that 150 days later, there's the 40 days of flooding, of raining and flooding, And after that 40 days, Noah must have known something was different about the outside world because he feels comfortable opening the door of the ark, or not the door, sorry. Don't open the door of the ark. That's a bad idea. He opened the window of the ark, and so he had kept it closed for the 40 days of flooding and raining, but he opened the window once he could tell something was different outside. But I can't imagine what it was like to look out and just see nothing but water everywhere. That must have been a pretty sickening sight. That was after 5 months. 150 days, 40 days he opens the window, but 150 days into this flooding, it says in chapter 8 and verse 1 that God remembered Noah. After the 150 days, he remembered Noah. And so that's not the idea that God had forgotten about him and, he was busy playing video games or taking a nap, and then it's like, oh, Noah, I should go feed that guy, make sure he's all right. It's not that he forgot about him. Remembered in the Bible is the idea of it's time to do something. God always knew what to do, but now it's time to do something. Noah has been on the ark floating around in the water for 5 months, and God says, now it's time to do something. And so he sends a great wind so that the water begins to move and to dry. And, what's interesting is it says it wasn't until, I think, the 7th month, in chapter 8 and verse 4, it was in the 7th month that the ark finally rested on the top of a mountain. But, Noah looking out the window, he probably couldn't even see that. He maybe felt them hit the mountain, maybe, but he couldn't see anything. And then it says it was the 10th month that finally you could see the tops of the mountains, that they were visible. But if Noah wasn't facing the right direction, he still couldn't see them. He would have just seen water everywhere. Now, maybe he could see them, I don't know, but it's possible that even 10 months in, he's still looking out and he can't see anything. He's not floating around. He knows he's grounded, but he can't see anything. And so 7 months before he hits anything, 10 months before he maybe can see anything, in the 5th month when God sent the wind, that's when God did something. Noah probably didn't even know that he had done it. I mean, there's really, other than wind blowing, there's no evidence. And if you had been in an ark for 40 days in hurricane weather, and the wind starts blowing again, what do you think is happening? You might be thinking, I thought this was over. I thought we were done with this part. You might start panicking, thinking, I'm going to close the window and not, I don't want to see what's going on out there. It doesn't say that God told Noah, I'm going to blow a wind. It says God knew that now was the time to send the wind. But Noah, if he even noticed the wind, didn't have any indication that that was there to dry it up. And it's not until month 10 that maybe he can see the mountaintops. And so for 10 months, nothing seems to change, and all Noah can do is wait. And it says that he spent that time as the ultimate bird watcher. If there's any bird watchers here, Noah is the ultimate bird watcher. He had nothing better to do with his time, literally, than just watch birds. And so it says he sent out ravens week by week. Every week he'd send the raven out, and the raven would come back empty-handed. And every week he'd send the raven out, and he did that for months and months and months, until finally, very close to the end, he starts sending out a dove instead. And so he sends the dove out one time, and the dove comes back empty-handed, nothing. He sends the dove out a second time, and this time, finally, the dove comes back with an olive branch. And, we tend to think of doves and olive branches as signs of peace. I think that's because of this story. I don't know that that's necessarily what Moses is communicating with those symbols. But he does come back with that olive branch, and it says Moses knew. Moses. Now Moses is on the ark, and Noah's on Mount Carmel, and Noah knew that the land was finally dry. And a week later, he sent the dove out one more time, and he never saw that dove again. And so all of this time, Noah is just waiting and waiting and waiting. And so, first God said jump, and Noah said how high. Now God says stay, and Noah says how long. And he's willing to just wait for God all of this time. Ultimately, he was in the ark for 1 year and 10 days. And so Noah made choices, aware that sometimes when God is trying to save someone, that means just waiting. And really, if you think about it, Noah waited a year, but God had waited, in essence, more than 1,000 years. Noah waited a little more than a year. God waited more than 1,000 years for man to be saved. That's what Genesis 5 tells us. It describes the long lifetimes of these people. It goes through and describes how some of them lived almost 1,000 years. And if you add them all up, it's 1,000 and I think 69 years accounted for. If you add all of them up and subtract out the differences between when people were born and when they had kids, you get, I think, 1,069 years. Now, we're not to understand that literally. This is a poetic thing, like we talked about last time, Genesis chapter 5, and they're probably missing generations. It probably was longer than that. But it gives us that 1,069 years of God waiting. We know that people had already fallen. Adam and Eve fell. Cain had murdered, and his family is just a mess. That's very obvious as you read through the lineage. People were already doing wrong, and for more than 1,000 years, God is waiting with long suffering for them to change, giving them the time that they need to repent until that moment when he knows none of these people are going to. And so he asked Noah to wait a year for salvation, but God had waited more than 1,000 years for salvation. God had suffered through the evil of man for more than 1,000 years. A year doesn't seem all that long in comparison to more than 1,000 years. Noah just kept waiting. It's the idea of Psalm 27 and verse 14. In Psalm 27 and verse 14, the psalmist writes these instructions. He says, "Wait on the Lord, be of good courage, and he shall strengthen your hearts. Wait, I say, on the Lord." If we want to be that one kind of person that pleases God, the psalmist says sometimes that requires patience and long suffering. Sometimes it means you're in a spot that you don't really want to be in. You're stuck in an ark with who knows how many stinky animals, and all you can really do is just wait on God. But that if you will be of good courage, he will strengthen your heart. He will give you what you need to make good choices even as you wait. And you can wait that out. Because as long as you're having to wait, you know it's because God is also waiting. You know that the reason why Jesus hasn't come back yet, why we are still here, sometimes suffering through this life, is because God is also waiting for people who have not yet been saved. You know that if God had come back at some point in your life before you were saved, you also would not have been saved. Aren't you glad he waited for you? We can happily wait for other people too, waiting on the Lord. And so you do get the idea that Noah was seeking information. That's why he sent the doves out. He was waiting. He was looking for information. That's what Moses describes in Psalm 90, verse 13. In Psalm 90, verse 13, and this is over and over in the Psalms, people will say, "How long, O Lord?" Psalm 90 and verse 13, Moses wrote that psalm, it seems very much with the idea of the flood in mind after having written Genesis 5 through 9. He writes this idea of the flood, and he says, how long do we have to wait? It's one thing to seek information, but Moses, Noah, none of these people ever try to take God's place. They never try to take God's role, and they never try to rush things along when God has said, it's time to just wait. The last chapter of this section, Genesis 9, going through verse 17, and Genesis 9, back in chapter 8, starting in verse 20, through chapter 9 and verse 17, you finally have Noah getting off the ark, and the first thing he does is he builds an altar, and it says there that the altar, he burns on it a sacrifice of some of the animals that, I imagine it was the really annoying ones that he burned on the altar, can't wait. No, there were specific ones that it was right to burn. The clean ones is the one that he burned. And it says he burned an altar, and it was a soothing aroma to the Lord. That's, if you've ever had a candle that you were really stressed and it smells like something you like. Some people that's, that cotton smell or leather or something that's very calming to you, and you burn that, and you just kind of feel your blood pressure lowering and you kind of feel better. That's the idea. It's a soothing aroma to the Lord. And the idea of a soothing aroma is that he was pleased. That he was pleased with what Noah had done. Now, I think that the sacrifice was really sort of a symptom of that. He wasn't necessarily, the sacrifice is not really what God cared about. And Jesus says that too, he says, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. Sacrifices at the end of the day are not really what God cared about. People could burn sacrifices throughout the Old Testament that God wasn't pleased with, even though the sacrifice itself was perfectly accurate. The right animals, the right time, the right fire, everything was right, but God wasn't pleased with the sacrifice because he wasn't pleased with the person. That's what was wrong with Cain. Maybe there was nothing wrong with his sacrifice. We don't really know. But that wasn't really the point. The point was Cain. His heart wasn't right. And so when it says that he was soothed or pleased by Noah, he was pleased by who Noah was. He was pleased by the fact that Noah was attentive, that he listened closely to what God said. He took him seriously. He knew God meant it. And so he did his best just to obey with faithful righteousness, trusting in the grace of God. He was pleased with the fact that Noah was willing to wait, and he didn't start disassembling the ark and trying to make an escape boat, or, that he could see the land for the last month or so, and he didn't get off before God told him to, as much as he probably wanted to. He didn't just get off, he waited until God said. Now, he was pleased that Noah was willing to do these things, and so the sacrifice is just a symptom of that. The sacrifice is just a way of God seeing Noah really is all in. He's willing to listen. He's willing to wait for me. And so, Noah receives all of the treasures, the blessings that God wanted to give the whole world. This is what he intended everybody to have. But Noah's the only one who gets it. It's the idea of Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 6. In Hebrews 11 and verse 6, it says that only those people who believe that God is, and who believe that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him, who chase after him with everything they are, only those people receive the reward that God wants to give them. Only those people can please God. And so we see God blessed him with a lot of things. He blessed him with food, for one. Remember, under Adam, the ground had been cursed. And now God lifts that curse so it's not so hard to farm. And in the next section, Noah has a little bit too much fun farming, and that becomes a different problem. But it's easier to farm now, and so he has food. It says there's consistency. Verse 22: while the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, winter and summer, day and night, they shall not cease. This is a promise of God that lasts until the Lord returns. People talk about, some kind of global, awful experience that's going to change the entire climate of the world. And the world's climate does shift sometimes. Historically, you can see that. It will shift hotter or colder at different times. But God says we don't have to be afraid of the world getting so cold or so hot that we can't live here anymore. We don't have to make plans to live on Mars someday, because when the earth remains, if the earth is still here, God says, seed time and harvest, somewhere on earth, we'll be able to plant things. Cold and heat. Now, it might be, cold and heat are relative to what you're used to, but there'll be some degree of cold and some degree of heat. Winter and summer, day and night, they shall not cease. Consistency. Noah has food, and it's easier to grow. He knows exactly what to expect from year to year, and exactly what God has promised him. He has order. And notice in verse 6, God essentially sets up the idea of the right to govern. Whoever sheds man's blood, whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. Not by God, by man his blood shall be shed. The idea is God is telling Noah, if your descendants start killing each other, you have the right to practice capital punishment. That's essentially what he's saying here. That man has the right to, as a government authority, Noah being the government, he's the father of the patriarchal system, to practice capital authority, to keep justice and to keep order. And so he gives Noah that right. Now that's important when you think about Cain, because Cain was worried about the same thing, right? He had murdered his brother, and he was concerned that Cain was Cain was concerned that Abel's relatives, someone along the way, maybe Adam, maybe he was concerned about Adam, was going to take vengeance on him, and essentially this idea that his blood was going to be shed because he had shed Abel's blood. And so God has mercy. He puts a mark on him and says, don't kill him. And so Cain had God's mercy, but God says, generally speaking, man has authority and right to do this. And so there's the idea of order. Noah doesn't have to worry if they start killing each other, are we going to get to the same place that we did before the flood? No, we can have order and keep things safe for people. And then finally, he gives Noah comfort. And that is, he says, it's going to rain again, but I'm never going to flood the whole earth again. And when the rainbow is in the sky, notice it's interesting, he doesn't say that's a reminder for Noah, although it is. He says, notice in verse 13, I set my rainbow in the cloud, and it shall be for the sign of the covenant between me and the earth. It shall be when I bring a cloud over the earth that the rainbow shall be seen in the cloud. And notice verse 15, he says, I will remember. I will remember. Now, God doesn't need an alarm clock or reminders. He doesn't have a smartphone that dings and says, don't flood the earth, don't flood the, he doesn't need that. The point is, someday it's going to rain again, and Noah is going to have PTSD about this flood situation. And he's going to think, oh no, we've messed up, and God's bringing the flood again, and this is it, I'm done for. And God gives him that comfort to say, when you see that rainbow, I want you to know, I have not forgotten. I will never flood the whole earth again. You don't have to panic. It's going to be okay. He gives him that comfort to know exactly what to expect from God. And so God blesses him with this overabundance because he was the kind of person who sought God's reward with attentiveness, with obedience, with patience, because he knew God was perfectly serious about anything that he said. And he knew God was worth it. He is the right person to listen to because of who he is. He was worth it. And so Noah is the only kind of person that pleases God. It's not based on personality. Extroverts are pleasing to God and introverts are not. It's not based on race or on gender. It's not based on age. The only thing that matters when it comes to pleasing God is if you've chosen to make yourself the kind of person that does please God. No one is born innately with these qualities. Everyone has the choice to choose to develop this for themselves. And so the question is, are you that person? Do you take God as seriously as Noah did? Are you willing to make huge changes in your life that can't be hidden, that require you to openly explain to hostile people who maybe don't want to hear the truth? I think about Stephen. Stephen was just a good Jewish male, just living his life as a Jew from a Greek country, going to the synagogue and having a good time with all of his Jewish friends at the Jewish Greek synagogues. And then he learned about Jesus, and he converted. And now he's made such a big change that he finds himself in the same places where he used to be safe, having these debates and discussions, trying to convince them of the truth. And it's so obvious to them what he has done. It's so plain to them how he has changed that they stone him, they kill him. Are you willing to make those kinds of changes, as big as an ark, can't be hidden, even if you know the people around you are not going to like it? Sometimes that's what it takes to please God. And if we know that he is serious, if we know that he is worth pleasing, we'll make those kinds of changes. Are you willing to suffer horribly through this life and go through terrible things, waiting on God to come and to make everything right, without taking his role or rejecting him? I think about Job. I think about everything that Job went through. None of those things were his fault. He didn't do something wrong that required those things to happen. In fact, it says really, it happened because he was righteous. That's what Jesus said. That's what Peter said in 1 Peter, that we will suffer just simply because we are righteous. That's what Job did. But he waited And God said he was righteous. He did not sin in the things that he said because he waited on God. He knew God was worth waiting for. If you're willing to be that kind of person, then God offers life like he did to Noah. And he offers life abundant with blessings beyond anything that we could anticipate. Now, Peter says that in a sense, the flood is still coming. And as we close, I want to finish by reading 1 Peter chapter 3. 1 Peter chapter 3, starting in verse 5. In 1 Peter chapter 3, in verse 5, he says, "For this they willfully forget, that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of water and in the water, by which the world that then existed perished, being flooded with water." And so, of course, he's talking about Noah's day. It says in verse 7, "But the heavens and the earth, which are now preserved by the same word, by the authority, by the word of God, still stand today, are reserved for fire until the day of judgment and perdition of ungodly men." That's what happened in chapter 6. Ungodly men brought the destruction of the world. Peter says it's going to happen again. The ungodly will bring the destruction of the world. But verse 8, "Beloved, do not forget this one thing, that with the Lord, one day is as 1,000 years, 1,000 years as one day. The Lord is not slack concerning his promise, as some count slackness, but is long-suffering toward us, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance." This is why we're still here, why God waits so patiently. But, verse 10, "The day of the Lord will come." God is perfectly serious. It will come. "It will come as a thief in the night, in which the heavens will pass away with a great noise. The elements will melt with fervent heat. Both the earth and the works that are in it will be burned up. Therefore, since all these things will be dissolved, what manner of persons ought you to be in holy conduct and godliness, looking for and hastening of the coming of the day of God, because of which the heavens will be dissolved, being on fire, and the elements will melt with fervent heat. Nevertheless, we, according to his promise, look for new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells." What manner of people should we be, knowing God is perfectly serious? We're the only kind of people that God ever saved. People like Noah. People who wait. People who work with obedience and trust. People, when God says jump, they say how high. When God says sit, they say how long. People who change to be like God. If you are not that person, God's invitation is open to you this morning. He can teach you how to have the salvation that he supplies from this judgment. Or we can pray with you and help you to overcome whatever is challenging you. Whatever you need, we ask that you come forward now as we stand and sing.